And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
All right, and welcome to the show. Good theme music to kick us off here. We're talking about estate law, and we have our experts in studio today, John Lakes and Emmanuel Fung of LakesWhyteLLP in North Vancouver. And we had your partner on, John, on an earlier show, and I always like to comment that you have lots of free parking. It's a big deal for people, isn't it?
It's a huge deal on the North Shore.
Yeah, it's a big deal anywhere. If it's in Vancouver, they'd pave it and put a tower on it. So it's nice to hear. So today we're going to be talking about probate. So before we get into that, John, I want you to introduce the newest member of your team. Emmanuel has been with you for how long?
Well, Emmanuel's been with us on and off since 2000 because he worked one summer for us as an articling student. I don't know whether we inspired him to go to law school or not. And then he's a North Shore native, went to Sentinel High School, and he articled with us. And I'm going to let Emmanuel tell you more about himself.
We were joking with your partner also about the fact that you only hire lawyers from North Vancouver. So that was the first test you passed to get in on board,
North
right?
Shore.
The North Shore, I guess.
North
I think
Shore,
it's a little wider than
the North Van, but yeah, North Shore.
I don't know how it ended up that way, but I guess people who work on the North Shore never like to cross the bridge.
Yeah,
so,
it's better for traffic.
Yeah, it is.
So why law? Why did you want to get into law?
Well, as John said, I worked for him for a summer as a receptionist, and I guess he didn't scare me off, and I kind of liked it. So I came back and decided to go to law school. So that was.
And you decided to get back into estate law too, right?
And well, it happened. I think that our firm's practice of estate law has just evolved because of the needs on the North Shore and the needs in Vancouver generally. Estate law has become a really big area. People are getting older. Real estate is worth a lot of money now, and it's something that people have to put a little bit more thought into now.
And John, you're seeing that with the price of homes affects people's or clouds their vision a little more, or they're getting a little more pointed with their what they're entitled to. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, what we're seeing is that a lot of people are land rich. We're seeing the Saskatchewan generation sort of beginning to die off. The people that were born in the 30s who can remember their mother still feeding people to food during the Depression. They came to the North Shore. They bought a house in a modest house in, let's say, Ambleside area. They could get a house for $48,000 in 1958, and they've never moved, and all of a sudden that property's worth millions of dollars. And some of their kids have done better than others, and some of the kids their whole estate planning has been based on mommy and daddy dying. And so we had an estate not long ago where the woman had $8,000 in the bank, and her land was worth almost $3 million. So it's so the generation of savers is
they're passing on,
but they're creating very large estates, and then there's plus part of the reality too is that when I was Emmanuel's age, for every one person retired, there were 4 people working. Now for Emmanuel, for every one person retired, there's only 2.5 working. So I think that
he's going to have to work harder to pay for our CPP.
Well, but not only that, but I think we warn all our clients when they do their estate planning, and it started with Paul Martin and continues with Stephen Harper, and now very much continue with Trudeau, is that a lot of these things that are passing through estates, which are tax-free, I don't think they'll be tax-free much longer. And they're trying to simplify the tax system. I mean, already there's been an increase in maximum gain. And so one of the things that people don't realize when someone dies, we'll talk about the taxation more, but the year of death is when all your tax consequences come home, which can be very, very substantive as well.
So we have to get to the basics of when someone passes away, and then the will needs to be recognized, and then you can move through the process of finalizing that will. That's called probate, right? So
right.
How do you start that process? The executor does what?
All right, so let's say your mother dies. So they phone us, and so the first thing we'll do is talk to them about what their assets are. And generally, if assets are less than $25,000, you don't need probate. So typically, husband-wife long-term marriage, when they're not, they may not have any assets. It's only when the second person passes that there's big estate. So Amanda will go over the assets that are excluded when one person dies. So,
well, so generally, you know, everything in your estate that isn't held jointly.
So like a house, right?
So like if you've got, you know, bank account or a house that's held jointly, all other assets pass into the estate. The other exception to that are plans like RRSPs or RRIFs or life insurance or pension plans. For these types of assets, you can actually designate a beneficiary. And
So I have an insurance policy. My wife is my beneficiary. There's no question if I pass away, she's going to get all of that money. It's not going into the estate.
unless she's murdered you.
Oh, yeah. Maybe the insurance policy wouldn't pay out then.
No, they'd be paid out, but you cannot benefit from a
murder,
crime you've committed. So
All right.
manslaughter, yes. Murder, no.
Oh, okay, okay.
So those assets just pass right over the estate, and you don't need probate. So you can write to the insurance corporation, for example, and say, you know, I'm the surviving beneficiary, and it gets, you know.
So it's
gets
all
paid
of the stuff
directly.
outside of that. So the house, if it's jointly owned, goes to the spouse. Insurance policies, RRSPs, bank accounts that you're jointly listed on, that automatically would go, say, to the spouse. So it's everything else, right?
Yeah, as long as it's not overly complicated. I mean, one of the things with joint assets, which we had another show talking about it, and we can't talk about, is there's a presumption that joint assets are going to the survivor. However, sometimes people try to put joint assets to defeat other children's interests or things like that. So joint assets can be challenged.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there's a mother with two sons, and she puts house on jointly with one son. The other son may say that's really just an attempt to defeat my interests.
I see, I see. So it's not always locked down. It can be contested.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. So what about fees? Like so you start the process, and what are you typically looking at to get started?
Well, I want to clarify, and between Emmanuel we'll divide into topics. I'm going to talk about the probate fees because there's a misconception in British Columbia that we pay huge succession fees. People go to places like California or England, which is a nightmare. So generally, as a beneficiary, any money you receive from an estate, you don't pay any taxes. That's the post-tax money. So if your mother gives you $100,000, the money you get is after all her estate's been paid taxes. So
the taxes would be only what her personal situation would need, like as income, right? Or your CRA, you have to clear everything up with CRA.
Well, yeah, CRA comes first.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we pay what's called probate fees, and probate fees, there's zero between 25,000, 25 to 50 is 0.6. After that, it's 1.4%. So on $1 million, it's $14,000, which, you know, it's
too onerous, no.
And I mean, the odd thing about this tax, and I don't know whether it's a bad joke or not, that 98.6% of your estate is excluded from probate fees. And that's the same as your blood temperature. So, I mean, it's just... But, so it's based on what you've calculated the fees to be, the value of the assets, which can get a bit complicated with a house. So for example, Emmanuel's going to talk about capital gains, but the issue with a house, let's say your mother has a house on South Granville, and for BC assessment value, it's $1.1 million. However, you've got a developer coming along who wants to give you $2 million for it. So generally what we would advise that you pay the probate fees
on the lower amount.
No, the higher amount
for
$2 million, because what happens is, because this is your mother's house, it would not be subject to capital gains.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, you declare it's worth $2 million and you're paying probate fees at 1.4%, because the problem is if you do it the other way around and you pay probate fees at 1.2 and you sell the property for $2 million, there's a possibility that you might have to pay the capital gains on the $800,000 difference.
I see, yeah.
Which is a lot higher. So
you're saying on that $2 million, you're about $28,000.
Yes, that's right. So I'd rather pay $28,000 than $200,000. But there is a lot of concern now because they thought that both the federal and the provincial government are beginning to look at those values a bit more, and become a bit more aggressive about it. But
So the old joke is there's two things you can't avoid. It's death and taxes, and even in death they tax you, and you're thinking that might go up.
well, we're going to talk about it in a second, but I mean the probate fees are the least of your taxes, and
Right.
I always say to people, look, it's like your last year's health expenses, because generally 50% of someone's health costs occur on the last year of your death. Now, you know, I'm pretty conservative, but I still want to have hospitals. You know, you still have to pay for these things. So I think there's worse things in life than probate fees.
And there's a lot of planning. You know, people come in and they've arranged title to their homes for everything that passed through joint tenancy, and their motivation for doing this has always been because they're afraid of probate fees and they want to avoid probate fees. But oftentimes, planning to avoid probate fees causes more problems, and you know.
Can you give me an example, like how you could get you chase down the rabbit hole and you end up paying more money in the long run?
Well, first of all, you put your son on title, only to find out that his wife's made a claim against the house, so he has to fight that off. Or else CRA looks at it and say, well, wait a minute, this property's gone up like $800,000 since you put the son on title, and he's never done anything to the house, so we want a capital gains on his portion.
So
because it's not his principal residence, for example.
Exactly. And so when you add someone as a joint tenant to a home, you know, the way CRA looks at that is that person now owns half of the home. And so their portion is not exempted from capital gains. And there's ways to plan around it, but if you don't take those steps and you just add children on as joint tenants, you end up paying more in capital gains tax than you would, you know, paying 1.4% of probate fees.
Yeah, because you know, I had no idea that it was that low. I thought it was much higher.
Well, that's why we wanted to bring this as a topic.
Yeah.
And you got to remember.
So sometimes you're better just to pay it off, and then there's no claim after that, right?
You know what?
You just pay it and it's done.
You keep it simple, because the other problem you have is that people can go ahead and do all these elaborate plannings, but the government could eliminate it tomorrow. And so that's what's happened with a lot of people who've done some of these elaborate trusts. All of a sudden, can't do them anymore.
So if you just say to settle the amount that's in the estate and pay the probate fees, once the probate fees have been paid, there's no way to come back and get more money from you. Is that the end of the taxation?
Well, the problem you face is when you apply for probate as executor, you have to say, if I find more money, I will pay those probate fees. So, for example, let's say you're dealing with mother's estate, and lo and behold, you found out she had another $100,000 account after you got probate. So you'd file a supplementary affidavit in the court and say, I found this extra money, here's the extra probate fees. So you pay the 1.4. But what people were trying to do with property is they were trying to apply for a reassessment, and the probate registry said you couldn't do that. So
for what reason? Why would they?
Well, because what is it? I don't know what the reason is. I think they're worried about people trying to have their cake and eat it too. Pay lower probate fees but avoid capital gains.
Right. So, yeah, they're trying to pay on the lower amount.
But I don't know how long. I mean, I don't know.
It's going to be interesting to see. Like you said, I mean, there's a lot of money sloshing around now with these values of these homes, and the government must see that and think, well, we can use some of that money.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, we had an estate last year where the property was assessed for $850,000. When we applied for probate, we get clients to actually pay for an appraisal. You can't use a real estate. You pay appraisal, and it's about $300.
Yeah.
So we paid probate fees based on 1.4. The property is now sold for 1.75. And so we've sent our client to an accountant to determine if they have to pay any capital gains. I don't think they will, because under the current think of CRAs, you've got a year to wind up the estate.
Right.
So if they sell it within a year, there shouldn't be a problem. The problem is if you hold on to that property for a few years,
it goes up.
Then you've got a capital gains, and then the issue is where's your base price? Because
so that's when you need the advice of an accountant. Right?
You need because if you put a base price of $850 to avoid probate fees, and now worth $5 million, well, they're going to say,
hello, we want our money. Well, it's an interesting conversation. When we continue our conversation, we'll get into all kinds of different things, RRSPs, RIFs, pensions, when it comes to estate law. Joining us in studio, John Lakes and Emmanuel Fung from Lakes White in North Vancouver. We'll continue right here on The Law Show.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.